but we are queued up with all of the required elements, which is our keynote speakers. I'm so delighted to have them both here, Ixchel Faneuil and Lisa Johnston, and they're really in a position to see the challenge that we have, that we're all dealing with. And I just want to share an anecdotal story with you. So lots of things happening at AGU. So Shelley saw with the American Geophysical Union. I'll explain more as to why I'm the one talking to you, which probably befuddles many of you. We were having a meeting this week, inviting the Earth, Space, and Environmental librarians to a discussion with our publications and meetings team and the work that I do. I brought up, the work that we're trying to help our authors with citing data, and it's a real challenge, and this new effort that we've got. And librarians is like, well, explain to me how you see this relationship between domain repositories and general repositories. Are there any more domain repositories coming online? Is there a concerted effort? And I had to share, now maybe some of you have some other stories, but I had to share, oh, hi, Marianne, really good to see you. I had to share that, no, that's not really the case. They usually come from a community effort and eventually evolve to what's a preservation level domain repository, but no, they don't just show up. And the entire body of people who were there, these are our librarians, they're like, listen, our authors are using general repositories significantly. There aren't enough domain repositories. So this very problem we're talking about just really hit home again this week on how difficult it is. So I'm going to share my screen. I'd like to introduce Marianne Martone, who is the co-chair of this session. Seriously glad you're here.
I didn't realize, I'm so used to being on online meetings, and then it occurred to me I needed to register, and that's what I was doing.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, sorry.
I probably, never mind. We can take that offline. That'll be the first bottle of wine we share after this meeting. Can somebody confirm they're actually seeing my screen properly?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I'm so delighted. This is a BOF. This is our first time meeting in RDA, but not our first time having this conversation, and certainly not the first time that this is a topic within RDA. There are a number of groups working on it from different angles, and we are very interested in connections to those working groups. If someone who has our common notes page, perhaps scroll away in one of the emails I've sent you, if you could pop it in the chat, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. It looks like somebody may have done that. And please, if you could just let us know who you are, and you'll find a number of the links to the materials that we're going to be sharing. So scooting along, here's our agenda. We have two amazing keynote speakers who are just really working hard in this area. And I'm really delighted that they're available for you tonight. I owe them both dinner because of my poor skills in planning and their willingness to be available tonight. I'm just really delighted that they made themselves, prepared themselves in a short time. So I'm very appreciative. Marianne and I are going to walk you through the precursor meeting that happened at NIH. All of that content is available in the links that are provided, but we'll give you a really high level of the outcomes that came from that meeting and leading into this one. And hopefully we'll just continue to build. And then depending on how many of you will do, we'll bring up this concept of what does it mean to look at a generalist repository and make the data or consider what it means for that data to be reusable. And Ixchel Faneuil is going to really help put that into context. I'm really excited about her research. Okay, moving on. I don't want to spend too much time on this front stuff. So before today, there was this workshop, and it was amazing. There were gobs of people, both physically located at NIH and online. The organizers came from NIH. You see their names there. I think some of them are online, and I'm glad they're here. And it was really nicely put together, the content and their plenary sessions, and I just on and on. Of course, I'm seriously biased on this, right? But what happened were three major outcomes. And 2 days, lots of content. Please go peruse the recordings and the slides. Marianne, I'm going to hand this over to you if you feel it, because you've got a really good take on Coopetition. If you could talk to that one. So I'm giving you a few seconds to get your brain together.
Okay.
There are these three themes, and any of the talks helped to fill in what the elements were on these three particular topics. And Marianne, if you could take Coopetition and that would be fantastic if you could talk to that. I just put a couple bullets together.
Sure. I think that this term was introduced by Saeed Chowdhury, who gave the keynote, an excellent keynote. If you have an opportunity to listen to it, if you haven't, it's really worthwhile. And of course, there were a lot of commercial entities in the generalist repository space, I think more so than in the specialist repository. And he pointed out again that these repositories span commercial, nonprofits, government, and academics, and introduced this idea of coopetition, which relies on this concept, the value line. And in commercial entities, he basically introduced the idea that there are things that obviously they compete. It is the nature of commercial entities that they compete with each other. However, there are things that what they call below the value line that they all need to take care of where they don't compete. In this case, I think he gave the example of seat belts, right? All the car manufacturers have all their special bells and whistles that they compete on. And, you know, this car is better than this one, but they all use seat belts and they all have the same standards for seat belts. And so he thought that this was a really good concept for this concept that we have lots and lots and lots of repositories. They are going to specialize in some areas. They're going to compete with each other by the services they offer, but there does need this to be this value line and where we cooperate on everything below it, such as things such as identifier systems, open standards, and other things, the types of services we provide. And I think that kind of carried throughout the entire workshop, right? This idea of where do we cooperate and where are we going to compete in order to bring better service. Yep,
and I think that really was a resonating concept. And I'll hit the other two really quickly. And Ixchel's going to talk more to this, but you have to have people to give context to the data that you're looking at, and that can be done in different ways. That's really critical. It's always going to be sitting in the middle. And then we really understand the data better when we've got the code or software that generated it. So keep those three things in mind as we're coming through, as our keynote speakers are presenting. And we'll be very interested in those topics as anything else that comes up in your mind during these talks. And what we're going to ask you on the other side is, all right, we understand the repository community rather well, maybe not perfectly. We understand the challenges of the changing behavior with researchers. There's a number of steps and gaps in between into making sure that our data is as reusable as possible. And what are the things that our community can start to move towards, and maybe other relationships with other working groups to help develop those. Okay, so those are keep those in mind as we're hearing our keynote speakers. So just something very quickly to highlight, we did have a really interesting a collaboration across all of the, not the institutional repositories. We did this with just the general repositories, although we do consider institutional repositories in the category, but just to be very honest, we didn't include them in this effort, and we know we didn't. But we pulled together a comparison chart that has a dynamic representation on FAIRSharing that I showed you before, but you can also download this. And I have to tell you, seeing the number of downloads, like anything Like there's nothing in my publications that are as beautiful as that. So it's really nice to know that people are finding this valuable. We know the PDF is static and ages. So the FAIRSharing collection will continue to improve as a dynamic collection. So that one's actually really useful. Okay, just sharing that with you. And Ixchel, that leads us right into your keynote. I'm going to queue up your slides. Take it away, Ixchel. Can we hear you? I'm not hearing you.
I didn't unmute. Sorry about that. So I'll just say it's 7 o'clock here. I'm kind of winding down typically. So we're going to see how this goes. So I first want to just say hi and thanks for inviting me. And so in thinking about the challenges of well-documented reusable data, for me, it's important to kind of think about how reuse unfolds. And so in this presentation, I'm going to provide some insight from studying what reusers need to decide whether or not data is reusable. And so Shelley, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide. And these findings that I'm going to talk about today are based on an IMLS funded study conducted with my colleague Elizabeth Yackel at the University of Michigan and a team of undergraduate and graduate students that helped us over the years. It started in 2010, the grant ended in 2014, but we're still publishing stuff out of it as well. And it was a partnership with us and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology, and Open Context. So in the next slide, you'll see together we secured 105 interviews and observations with quantitative social scientists, zoologists, and archaeologists. And we're really interested in understanding the types of context information that researchers needed when deciding whether to reuse data, and then kind of how their needs might differ across these three communities. So what we did is we asked them to focus on the last time they reused data. And all of these data reuse instances addressed new research questions. So you'll see a couple on the next slide, one of which is a social scientist interested in the co-occurrence of imprisonment rates with larger social and economic processes. And Shelley, if you can advance to the next one, that'd be great. And then a zoologist analyzing information from 20 species of frogs and lizards in light of climate data, or an archaeologist answering questions of society and economy and religion in ancient Middle East, relying on data excavated from the 1920s and the 1930s. So when we think about successful data reuse, we start thinking about studying reuse practices across these three disciplines. Successful reuse really came down to having information about data's context of production from a variety of sources, such that data's quality can be evaluated. So if we look at the next slide, I'm going to start by talking about context information. And so these are the types of information that researchers mentioned needing. And there are three categories of context with several types in each. The first, data production information, the second, repository information, and the third, data reuse information. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see that we have these 12 types of context again, but they're arranged by the frequency within the frequency researchers mentioned them when talking about their data reuse decisions. So that top bar represents the social scientists, the middle one, the zoologists, and the bottom bar, the archaeologists. And it's probably really no surprise to you. You'll see that data collection information was the most frequently mentioned type of context that these scholars wanted. At least 3/4 of them across all of these disciplines mentioned it. So for instance, we had social scientists that we interviewed, and they typically use quantitative data collected from surveys or questionnaires, and they mentioned data collection information the most, followed by data analysis information, data producer information, and prior reuse. If we look at that middle chart, bar chart, for the zoologists, these are folks that typically reuse data from specimens. So we can think about birds or fish or insects. And if we look at them, specimen information was mentioned the most, followed by data collection information, and then tied for third, provenance information and information about the data producer, followed by curation and digitization information. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the archaeologists. So these were folks that primarily reused data from artifacts collected at excavation sites, so animal bones or coins or pottery. And they actually look pretty similar to the zoologists. There's a little bit of flip. They talk about data collection information that was mentioned the most among the archaeologists, followed by provenance and artifact information, and then repository, reputation, and history. And following that, all with the same frequency of mention, or data producer information, data analysis information, and curation and digitization information. So if we look at the next slide, what we're going to see are the types of source or the sources of context information. So where these researchers went to get the information that they needed. So if we look again, the bar charts are social scientists on the top, zoologists in the middle, and archaeologists at the bottom. Social scientists mentioned needing most resources to some degree, right? But code books and documentation were terms that they used interchangeably. That was mentioned the most, followed by peer-reviewed publications. If we look at zoologists, they relied heavily on repository and museum records, peer-reviewed publications, and specimens. They also mentioned data producer records. And then if we look at the archaeologists, we can see that they also talked about data producer generated records, peer-reviewed publications, and repository or museum records. And the interesting thing here in terms of sources of context information was, with all this talk of online repositories and digital data, people were really still an important source of context information across all three disciplines. So we're talking about repositories that have been in existence for over 50 years and are well-run, well-oiled machines, and those that are younger, maybe 5 years at the time that we began doing these interviews, but older now. And so if we think about zoologists, they tended to, when they talked about people, they talked about the museum staff and data producers, and they went to them to get additional context information. Archaeologists often did the same, but they also used people to discover and access data. And then we had social scientists, and they relied a lot on colleagues to provide opinions about reusing data and to help them with data discovery. The other thing that was interesting from this slide is this idea of peer-reviewed publications. Zoologists and archaeologists use data producer publications to discover and access data, sometimes get additional context information. And social scientists also use data producer publications, but they also relied on publications that data reusers had out in the world at that point. And they really were looking to gauge, again, community interest and acceptance in that data. So we've talked about context information, we talked about sources. I'm going to talk about this idea of evaluating data next. And so on the next slide, you're going to see various data quality attributes that were used to assess reusability. So things like relevance, trust in data, credibility, interpretability, ease of operation, completeness, quality, accessibility, and data producer reputation. I'm really just going to focus on the top 5, just in the interest of time, just to give you a flavor of kind of what they were talking about and what these things meant. So we'll start with data relevance. And this really referred to the data fitting research questions or objectives. So whether the data was relevant to one's work, you can see was important to social scientists and zoologists, a little less so to the archaeologists. Social scientists and zoologists often talked about this in terms of fit, right, or topical relevance. And they often used data collection information and specimen information to make that assessment of relevance. We'll look next at data credibility. And in looking at the interviews, we coded for data credibility broadly. So it not only included references to credibility, but also references to data reliability, validity, accuracy, believability, things of that nature. And the major types of context information sought to assess these characteristics were typically information about data collection, the data producer, and the specimen or artifact. It was a major reason that zoologists and archaeologists sought context, but a little less so for social scientists, because they talked more in terms of trust in the data. And we decided to code trust separately from credibility. And we only coded trust when that word or different forms of that word were used. And it really signified the degree to which data reusers can rely on the data and the contextual information around the data being truthfully produced. So context information typically mentioned when assessing trust were things like repository reputation and history, data collection information, and information about the data producer. Interpretability. Let's talk about a little bit about that one. This basically affects whether or not the data can be understood. This is, one of the things that people talk a lot about, right? And so if we think about it across the disciplines, this was really a fairly strong reason for seeking some type of context information across all three groups. And data collection information was typically used to assess interpretability. Data analysis information was as well. And so the last one I'm going to talk about is ease of operation. And this is really about the effort involved in manipulating the data or updating it or integrating it. Archaeologists didn't mention it as much, but over half of the social scientists and zoologists did. And they both used data collection information to assess ease. Zoologists also relied on specimen information, and they used that primarily. So these context types were typically used to ensure consistency or compatibility of that data, or research designs across more than one study so that data could be combined for reuse. So in the next few slides, what I thought I'd do is just provide a couple of examples to illustrate how researchers talked about these context types in the context of the data quality attributes, just so you can kind of get a sense and a flavor for what they're saying. And so, as I said, researchers looking at data collection information for relevance, they often wanted to know about the study procedures, right? So here we have an archaeologist explaining different ways that archaeologists walk excavation sites, right? Which resulted in finding different data, right? Finding big things versus finding small things, and how knowing these kinds of procedures typically helped them assess whether or not there was a match between the data they were looking at and their research questions. If we look at the next slide, that's about looking at using provenance information for credibility. And so here we have a zoologist talking about provenance and this idea of tracing the data back to its point of origin, especially when he was unsure about whether a species had been identified correctly. He talks about this idea of tracing genetic data found in GenBank back to the physical specimen, that voucher specimen that's held at the museum, and using that being able to trace back and using that to assess the accuracy of the identification. If we look at this idea of prior reuse information and trust, we find that data that were widely reused, typically and a lot in social science, because they've been reusing data for so long, it indicated a level of peer review and acceptance. So this social scientist didn't formulate her own opinion about whether or not a survey is trustworthy. She actually relied on the collective judgment of the community to decide whether or not a survey was trustworthy. In the next example, that's looking at data analysis information for interpretability. So researchers discussed needing to understand how data producers transform data. A lot of the times they were talking about this idea of moving from qualitative data to quantitative data. And so this archaeologist is describing this need for documentation about codes and coding procedures used to classify soil types in order to interpret the data, to find out what A meant or what B meant in terms of the classifications that were used. And the last example is looking at data collection information and ease of operation. So here we have a social scientist looking to integrate data collected from different sources or points in time, which can be kind of tricky. And he's talking or explaining this idea of looking to see if the geography matched across data sets, because the boundaries, right, in terms of geography can change from time to time. And he really relied on the documentation about those boundaries to be able to understand whether or not he could integrate that data and integrate it properly. So when we think about these things, some of the implications for generalist repositories. I guess one of them that I see is this idea of, when serving multiple designated communities, work to capitalize on what's common and then mindfully monitor what's unique, right? So from the findings I presented, that might mean looking at these context types and using them to really start a conversation with researchers to get a better sense about what each of these context types comprise given the work that they do, and trying to uncover and unravel some of that in some ways. It's also about looking at this idea of, they also want to know about repository reputation and history, which, as folks in generalist repositories they provide that information. They don't look for the data producer to provide that information necessarily, as well as information about prior reuse and prior reuse publications. Second, we have this idea about aligning the needs of key stakeholders. So by that, I mean, we have data producers, we have reusers, we also have information professionals, right, that sit between the two of those two folks, right, whether they're data curators or data stewards, librarians, archivists, museum staff. And it's this idea of outlining the work that needs to be done to better align these groups, right? There's a certain result we want to obtain in terms of data deposit and reuse and sustainability of the repository. How can we think about, interlocking these different needs such that they're working for rather than against one another? And then lastly, this idea of considering specialist partnerships across generalist repositories. And what I mean really by that is, how can we begin to think about specialized knowledge, whether it's about disciplinary practices or technology or curation or metadata or needs upstream and downstream? How can we begin to think about those and leverage those across generalist repositories through collaboration, such that there isn't this constant need to be everything to everyone? Because in that scenario, typically we have to make trade-offs, and sometimes we're making some of the wrong trade-offs. So with that, I'll turn it over. I think I have some references here that everyone can take a look at in their free time, and I'll just say thanks and look forward to kind of the conversations as they unfold tonight.
Michelle, thank you so much. We'll take a moment, hold your questions or put them in the chat, or the common document. Probably the common document's better. And we'll let Lisa queue up her slides.
How's that look?
Fantastic.
Okay, great. Well, I really love hearing Ixchel talk, and I've been a huge fan of her research for a number of years now. I'm hopeful that this part of the presentation can transition from understanding what our reusers need in terms of trust and reputation and context, and try to take on that challenge as general repositories and provide that by working and collaborating with the data depositors themselves as they're publishing their data in our repositories. So with that, let's get my slides going. Just first a quick value of curation slide, obligatory value of curation slide. We are, we're defining data curation in this context of the encompassing work that we do as staff and curators of data repositories and archives. But we're doing this to provide meaningful and enduring access to the data. So it's really kind of steeped in this long history of archival theory, translating that for the digital. And we are striving for a number of things. You might typically see these things kind of bundled as the FAIR principles or even the trust principles. But we're really, I think for data repositories that do have to provide services to a wide range of data types, we also are striving to add kind of value and reuse potential. And reuse has kind of been our focus in the data curation network. And then, just some example curation activities here. So let me give you a little bit of context about the data curation network. This is a project that started in 2016 and has really grown over the years as we add more and more partners. Essentially, we're bringing people together in a shared staffing model to do data curation in a way that allows us to share the expertise of the curators who work at our different repositories, who have a deep expertise in a domain area, who have PhDs in neuroscience and public health, and who maybe have practiced in the field, who are now working for institutions, libraries, providing data library services and data repository services. But each one of us, can't have an army of data curators for every domain, for every discipline, for every file type that we work with. So this project is really, in essence, allowing us to leverage those experts in a shared way. We also provide, in addition to the coordination of the matchmaking for data sets to curators, we provide training and we do research. We come together in different special interest groups. We are a community. The project has been funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The repositories themselves, repositories have their own workflows, and we understood early on in the data curation network that we didn't want to disrupt those workflows. In fact, we really wanted the repository to really retain all of the ownership for their ingest process, for their local, accepting and rejection of the data sets. They do the appraisal, they select what goes in. They provide access, they provide long-term preservation, they provide storage services. What we, though, interject are the expert layer. So we provide the review by somebody who has an understanding of that domain, that file type, and we work through a standard set of data curation procedures for every data set. So there is a baseline or minimum curation. And then each expert can also apply their own domain expertise on top of that baseline curation. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these steps. Nancy McGovern was already mentioned in one of Ixchel's slides, and I have a reference here from her as well. Nancy describes this kind of collaboration where you're not just sharing information, you're not just sharing ideas, but you're actually relying on one another to get the work done. This is a form of radical collaboration, and this is really what we strive to do. A little bit of background, our project, as I mentioned, started in 2016. We had a planning phase where we really brought together, at that time, 6 institutions, 6 institutional data repositories who work directly with researchers. And I should mention, we're not just data repository managers, we're also data librarians and data management trainers. And we work very closely with the research teams, their students, throughout their data lifecycle. So we really are in a great position to influence how they practice data management so that we can hopefully receive better data in our repositories and in yours. With that in mind, we did 6 focus groups. We had a focus group at each one of these institutions where we sat down with researchers and asked them about what do they value in terms of the data curation work that they themselves are doing, but also what we are doing. And we really wanted to understand how to prioritize our work based on their needs. And that has been fundamental to all of the research in the data curation network. When we moved into our implementation phase, this is where we actually put our model into practice. We onboarded 2 new members, and this time we brought on all of the different data curators from our institutions. So we had 25 data curators that we trained in this kind of standard process, and we're able to actually try out this shared staffing model. And so far, it's been extremely successful. We've curated almost 200 data sets in this networked way. And over the years, we've gained additional new members, and we've added 2 new members every year during our implementation phase, which has been fantastic and allowed us to really scale up this entire program. We've also received funding from the IMLS to do education on our training procedures that we give our curators, but we were able to train over 150 individuals in addition to give them kind of this framework or this baseline of how to curate data in a general repository. And the outcome of these are what are called data curation primers. And I'll talk about that maybe in the next slide. This, again, is our curate steps. These are those steps that we ask each curator to run through as a baseline for the things that they do when they review the data set. Each step has its own checklist, and these checklists are evolving live documents. We are going back and reviewing them actually right now. We've got a sub-team looking at them. And then, as I mentioned, the data curation primers really come into play. For each different domain or file type, there are additional things that you might want to do. And each of those things are going to be different. You will, take a different approach when you're running through GIS data files than you would if you're running through crystallography data files. So that's where these primers have been really essential. And I can't thank the people enough who've been writing these. This is not just the Data Curation Network. These are the individuals who've actually attended our workshops. So they get together in teams and work for 6 months after the workshop on these data curation primers. And this is their capstone project that comes out of that. So it's really a community effort. So as I go through the curate steps, which I will just in a second, I really want to show you what the value of curation is. Hopefully I'm giving you some examples. But if you think, here's some just questions to kind of think through as I'm speaking. Just asking if our curators, our data curators are doing enough to enable reuse. What are the risks of not doing curation? And this is sort of with that lens toward, is it worth it? These are very time-consuming and expensive activities that we're doing. And then what can general data repositories do to help researchers create better data before it comes to the data repository, which I think is really the goal. So let's go through those steps, hopefully pretty quickly. But the curate steps, the general procedure that we have is that first we check the files. This really involves creating a manifest of what do we have? What did the researcher actually provide us? Oftentimes researchers will deposit large data sets that may be zipped up with hundreds and thousands of files. So in order for us to get a good sense of what actually we have here, we run it through what you see here, which is just a tree structure. We might just do an analysis of the number of data files, the file types, the sizes. And what we're really looking for here are, do we have what we need? Is there missing information? Are there duplicate files? Are there files that should not be in here at all? We also want to look for data sharing risks at this stage. We really want to know, do the data contain any human subjects information, personally identifiable information? We want to ensure that we're adhering to any participant consent forms at this stage, because we don't want to ingest the data if that's the case, if there's some violation there. We also look for copyrighted information. For example, we find that people might be uploading code that they've obtained from a third party. So either they got it from GitHub or they got it from another source, but essentially it's not theirs, right? So we're looking for information that they are depositing that is not theirs to give. And we're asking questions about whether or not they have those rights. The understand step, I think, is the most intensive piece of our process. Here is where we are actually opening the files. This is where we are looking for missing context. And as Ixchel said, this is really what the researcher is going to be looking for when they're trying to reuse the data. So what we try to do is try to be the first user. We try to read that documentation and understand, what is this data we're looking at? This example is a real example of data I've received in my repository. There are plenty of reasons why a researcher would remove all of that contextual information. You see here, there are no headers. We don't know what any of these columns mean. Some software actually encourage researchers to do that. If you want to actually port this into R, you might want to remove those headers just to make things run better for your analysis or your visualization. But when it comes to us, we actually need that context back. So this was a simple, hey, what are these column headers? And they responded with, oh, here they are, and we're done. We also want to try to understand the relationship between the files. Oftentimes, this is sort of, I think researchers feel you understand this naturally just by looking at the list. And it's really great to kind of get them to have a dialogue around how you would actually use the files in relation to one another or in relation to data that might exist elsewhere. So creating those linkages are very important. And sometimes we even just read the article and then try to bring in any collection methodology or analysis that might have been included in the article and bring it into the documentation file at this point. I will say this is also where we find that researchers may not be providing enough contextual information. We do a lot of README file creation in our repository. We actually work with the author to build a README, sometimes for the first time. And they go through that experience with us as kind of a guide. And I honestly can say the next time they submit their data set, it comes with a README file. And we are just really thrilled when that happens, because you kind of see this just-in-time training put to good use. And then I mentioned the primers. This is a list of the primers that we've got so far. We have 24 subjects of data curation primers on our website. Everything from working in, Tableau, Jupyter Notebooks, geodatabases. It's a real wide range of topics that are all driven by the community interest for those that came to our workshops. But each one of these primers goes into more detail about how you would approach specific file types, and you're going to be looking for different things. When you're looking at an SPSS file, you're ensuring that all the data variables are there. When you're looking at the GIS data files, you're going to look for the labels or the legends and make sure that each layer has been tagged. So there's really a lot of different approaches that people have been so generous in documenting. Next is the request step. This is where, and we do this, every time in the Data Curation Network, we actually talk to the researcher. We go back and we say, hey, we have some questions for you. We have a list of things that we think could make this data set better. And usually it's things that might be missing. I worked on a data set just last week where I found a couple of files that were missing just due to the way that they described the data set and their documentation, referencing files that just weren't there. And it was just a minor, okay, here it is, I forgot to add it. So not a big deal. Other times there's more major issues in the quality control and quality assurance issues, and we want to ensure that the researcher is really putting their best foot forward, and we're helping really protect their reputation sometimes, and ensuring that the data that they are publishing is in the best form possible. The next is the Augment Step, and here we do a lot of work in the metadata record itself. This is where we're really trying to enrich that record for findability and for reuse, where we'll add contextual information. We'll link to other reputational information, as Ixchel mentioned, maybe linking to their ORCID or to other related information like the article itself. And metadata, again, is one of those domain-based needs where you might have a data set that has a lot of domain-specific metadata. And what we can do in that area is sometimes we can pull out that metadata as a file on its own. It might not always be interoperable with our generalist data repositories. I personally don't have a field in my data repository for species and strain, but what we can do is make that metadata machine readable. We can pull it out as a text file. We can pull it out as something that Google and other search indexers can find. And that makes this data set a little bit more discoverable. And then the transformation step, here is where we're really thinking about the file formats themselves. Are they preservation friendly? We do make transformations of the data. Ixchel, for example, we'll create archival copies of each of the spreadsheets in a CSV file, but we'll also capture the formulas, any graphs that were used, what was the visual look of that spreadsheet? Do they use formatting and colors and highlighting? We do that using this tool called the Ixchel Archival Tool, which a graduate assistant of mine built, and it makes it really easy. It spits it out in just a few seconds. We also create derivatives for access purposes. We'll create thumbnails just for that visual display, or other versions that will help people really get an understanding of the data before they commit to downloading all those files. The last step is the evaluate step. This really just takes a step back and asks, is the overarching package fair? And were the changes made? Did all of our efforts result into a successful data publication, or do we need to go back and still work with the author to increase the value of that data set a little bit more? And then we also we also document our work. And the D added to the end of curate, of course, is curated. And that's really documenting what we as curators have done just for provenance and really making sure that we're tracking all the changes that were made. So just some final thoughts. As curators in Generalist Repositories, we have a lot of opportunity to make data sharing a better experience, but we also make the data better. So one really important thing to come away from my talk here is that we can really only do this as we take a very pragmatic approach. I listed a whole bunch of other examples. I would never ask one researcher for all of those things. Instead, we have to incrementally work with them to make their data a little bit better. So we often limit ourselves to maybe 3 things we think could be improved on a data set. And then, next time when we work with them, we might ask for a little bit more. And then also, I think that, as I mentioned, the data sets do come back better. So curation, I view it as a training experience. We are providing education at that moment through this practice of data publication. And researchers are benefiting from, our expertise as digital preservationists, as data librarians, as repository managers. And then I guess I don't know if this is we haven't heard much about FAIR, I think, in this RDA. So this is maybe a little outdated as now, but repositories, we do always aim to make our data fair. And I just like to think of us as curators trying to test that out and trying to prove that so that we can make sure that our data reusers and our data authors benefit from this whole data sharing process. So I guess if I have just another minute left, Shelley, I don't know how long I've been going.
Go ahead, please keep going.
Okay, great. As I mentioned, Ixchel and I have been working together for a couple of years and had a chance to present together on these topics before. And this is a crosswalk of all of the contextual information that Ixchel demonstrated and proved to us of how important they are to data reusers, and just thinking about the curate steps and the work that we've prioritized based on our observations and our interviews with researchers and depositors. I tried to map it over to some of the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve here. I won't go through all of them, but I do really like this exercise of putting our actions to the test. And as I mentioned, these are time intensive and expertise required actions for us as data curators. And it's always really important to link it back to why we're doing this and what are those outcomes. So thank you for having a chance to share that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Oh, and thank you for the blog post, Ixchel. I just really grateful for both of you and putting into context what researchers are actually thinking and how you're working directly with them. I think that really helps some of us that don't work with researchers every single day to see what those challenges are. I wrote down these are the 10 things. I don't have 10 things, but I wrote a few things down of, if I had all the money in the world, and by the way, there are some funders on the call, just so you know. So if I had all the money in the world, I would fund this, this, and this. And, there's reality, and then there's, what we've got. Lisa, you were talking about, and I've heard Mary Ann say this very same thing, you can't make a researcher be 100% what you'd love that data to be and still maintain a good relationship and help them on their journey. You can't jump them from one end of the yardstick to the other. They have to walk the inches as they get there, and they may not be able to walk them all at the same time. They won't be able to walk them all at the same time. And Mary Ann has said the same thing. She's talked about a little better, a little better. We make it a little bit better. Mary Ann, would you like to jump in on this maybe?
Oh, you're doing fine.
Okay. Well,
but it was very gratifying to sort of see that this is your approach, because data are just hard. They're hard. I mean, we have to admit that. And to go from here all the way to here, sometimes all the way here is wrong anyway, right? It turns out not to be necessary, or you're going down a path which, I mean, all of us have been through who've developed standards and others that was so complicated nobody ever used it, and then it was supplanted by something else. But I think where the sweet spot is, and I'm sure you've actually found this out too, is that the things that you're asking researchers to do are good for them as well, right? That it actually is good for them. It's good for their data. It's good for their labs. It's good for future them, as I like to say, because nobody ever regrets well-documented, well-structured data. As I usually say, you always regret when you don't have it. So that may be something else perhaps I was going to ask you to speak to. Is the feedback from the researchers positive about this? Because even though they may grumble a bit, I think it does genuinely improve their data.
We are having some questions coming in, and why don't we just take a couple minutes to explore those. Let's see. One of them that's in our notes document is, how is the data curation network related to the data discovery collaboration? We do know that there's two groups of collaborators, and wondering if there's an overlap or common goals.
We actually had a session about that earlier today. So you can watch the video of leveraging shared expertise networks that took place this morning. The data discovery collaboration is really looking at cataloging data sets. So they're creating a metadata catalog of data sets, and they've got a shared platform, which is open source, and are working through the issues around kind of that data cataloging, data discovery side, where I would say that data curation network is really more on the repository side, where we are all struggling with the issues of stewarding the data, housing the data, maintaining it for reuse, and we're finding a lot of overlap only in terms of, how do you build successful networks across multiple institutions and multiple individuals. I think that's really where the overlap has begun, and we're finding lots of things to talk about, as well as not just our two networks. Lots of different networks have come together. And I see that Yasusuki is on the call, who is also there with us this morning, representing groups in Japan. And so it's been really nice to be able to connect with different networks of people that are just really trying to do that radical collaboration.
So we have in the document, and also Claudia has a question in the chat. There's a couple related elements having to do with scaling. How do we help traditional librarians, because this is Claudia's question, work documentation? We've got a question on funding model for the data curation network. Those are kind of two different sides of the coin, encouraging people in the library community to move in this direction, and then how do you fund that? Maybe you want to talk to that.
I can certainly talk about the financial side of it. As I mentioned, we've been grant funded so far. We are transitioning to a sustainable model where we're actually finalizing the details through our legal right now. We're developing a membership model, and that was always the goal, to open up the data curation network so that we can bring in new members and find out different ways of participating in the data curation network. We understand that not everybody is going to have curators who can devote time to a project like ours. So coming up with different ways that people can still receive data curation services and training, but maybe not at that kind of collaboration level that we've been so far existing with. So with that, and actually through the wisdom of Josh Greenberg at Sloan, we've been thinking about sustainability from the start, and we've really been successful, I think, in having real deep conversations about how can we continue beyond the grant phase, and so that membership model is going to go into place next spring, and fingers crossed, will be fully sustainable going forward, and hopefully only grow from there.
That's great. And maybe the other side where Claudia's heading is, how have you coached, like who is it that your target audience is to bring over to the data side?
I'm entirely sympathetic of the solo data librarian, and I will definitely note every single person. We've got about 50 people in the network right now. Data curation is not their full-time job, including myself. There's nobody whose only job is data curation. So we have to be very mindful of the time expectation that we want from our colleagues on a project like this. And we monitor the time commitments very, very closely. And we don't want to abuse that, because our curators is our community. It's our primary service. It's our primary mission. So for individuals who are the only person doing data at their institution, we want to create a community that you would feel very happy and comfortable in as well. So that's, as I mentioned, we want to try to find different ways of interacting, and it could be working on a primer, as a team. It could be working, just on big problems in our field, like how to curate big data together with collaborations. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you dedicate your time to helping curate data across institutional repositories.
This community that we have on this session right now there's a number of experts in different areas, and I would really like to give an opportunity for everyone to pitch in on this thinking. And what I'm imagining is that we would, let me see if I have the capability of doing this. Okay, I could do breakout rooms. There are 33 of us. Marianne, I'm thinking 3 or 4. Nod your head there. Okay, let me see what happens when I do 4. We're going to assign them automatically, but I'm going to make sure that someone. Oh, can't put Ixchel and Lisa together. Okay, got to move you. Okay, all right. Ixchel, you're in number 1. Lisa, you're in number 2. Marianne, you're in number 3, and I'll take number 4. And if you can use and what you to do is think through tangible steps. You don't necessarily have to figure out funding, but think through tangible steps. How can we take some of these ideas and concepts that both Ixchel and Lisa have talked about, and frankly, all of your own experiences, and think about, let's pick on Zenodo, let's pick on Zenodo, and how can we make a better product go into Zenodo that's sustainable, that can actually work for a specific domain data type, and think about the number of players and what it means to knit that together. And that probably is like our next session on the actual knitting together. But if you can work on those ideas, and just like Lisa said, just like Marianne said, these are the first couple steps along the way. We're not going to go all the way to the end, but if we can think through what it means to get the first couple steps. Okay, I'm going to send you to your rooms. Edgar, I'm not sure if you're there, but all you need to do is click join the room. I think there's a little note in front of you. Maybe you stepped away. I am going to set myself. All right. How do I get to a room? To get to 4. Okay. And Stephanie, I swear to God, I pressed every button. I could not figure it out. I can do it on my own Zoom account, but I couldn't figure out how to do it on this. When you sent me the note, I'm like, ah.
Glad it helped.
That was, I literally felt like you sent me a life raft. This way, Shelley. All right, here they come. There we go. Did you wish I gave you another minute?
Yes. I was in the middle of a point, but anyway, we're back.
Do you want to finish your point? I don't mind if you take a minute.
No, we're good. There was a question as to whether peer review of data that is not published as part of a, a scientific study, to what extent that occurs. And I said I was not aware of it in the generalist repositories, except in the context that we heard a little bit about in the February workshop, where a group of domain experts are using it as a using the repository backend, and they're kind of curating and reviewing the data that's going in. So that was the point I was making.
Well, I didn't exactly explain to you all how this would work, but in the theory of once you're together, you need to report out. Marian, I doubt that was actually your summary for group 3, so just giving you leeway there. Yeah. Would group 1 like to talk about what they were thinking for a couple minutes? You were all prolific. There's lots of words in the note document. Thank you.
Does anyone want to pipe up? I typed the notes. I told them to correct me if I was wrong while they were speaking. So does anyone want to chime in first? I can just read it one. I can start by reading one to let you get your thoughts together.
We have only 15 minutes left, so maybe knowing that I can get back to each of the leaders of each of the groups past this meeting, if you want to just give sort of a general feeling or maybe highlight one or two.
I'm sure one was just this idea of maybe requiring a README upon deposit. So at least people have a starting point that they can then go back to. I mean, that speaks to one of the points Lisa was talking about the README file. Another was this idea of just better guidance as people are depositing things. Someone talked about intake forms just being so bad. And there's this idea of like having a common language, like you speaking and using language such that researchers understand what you're actually talking about when you're asking them for these things that they need to provide, whether it's metadata or, you need to have your data fair or whatever language we're using, but trying to think about how some of those things can be translated, I think is something that came up as well.
Okay, keep your fingers on the others. Since we have time, I'll come back and you can name us some more. Did you want to give us a couple from your group?
Who is that directed to?
Oh, funny. Lisa Johnston. That's right. There's more than one.
Sure. We were group 2, and we wanted, first we just wanted to have a little transparency about what is currently happening, and knowing, what curation actions are taking place at each of our repositories, I think would be a really good step. And maybe in addition to the wonderful matrix that you've created where it focuses in on the technical, but we should also know, what are the questions that are being asked at ingest. And then we talked a little bit about metadata, and it really noting that domain-specific metadata is so important and have been so well established and researched and thought out. So how can generalist repositories really apply domain-specific metadata? And I noted that Dataverse does this for a number of different schemas already. So if more generalist repositories put in some of the time, and it's hard work, but trying to bring in some of those different schemas, it could be really worthwhile. I'll stop there.
That's like a really good point. Mary Ann, do you want to give us a couple from group 3?
Sure. The conversation in group 3 turned almost immediately to motivations. So why would one want to curate data for these generalist repositories? And so we were talking about those different motivations. One of which was data citation was mentioned quite a bit. Claudia talked about her experience in Brazil with a network that was really pushing data management, and the thing that seemed to resonate was the idea that the articles would be cited. We also heard that from one other person, and I can't remember that data citation was a motivation. I was, even though I'm a big fan of data citation, mentioned some of my experiences currently with researchers' attitudes towards it, at least in the US. And one researcher said that she was very upset that data citations were cluttering up her profile on ORCID, and was wondering if we couldn't remove them or at least demote them, because people didn't know what they were. And also how difficult it has been inside of the US Brain Initiative to actually cite these data, these very complex data sets that are split across multiple repositories and bundled and rebundled. So I said, we still have work to do on data citation, which I think everybody knows. The other motivation that was brought up was data management. That's something I brought in, that again, things that practices inside the lab that are good for management in the lab often translate very well to what the type of curation that's needed for the generalist repositories. And finally, Ishwar had brought up about this issue of peer review, and whether, I guess, the idea of having expert peer reviewers and getting credit for peer reviewing data sets could be something else that would motivate, because as we talked about, that would also tend to improve the quality of the data. I think
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So group 4 and Ixchel, I'll come back to group 1. So just to get your thoughts going that direction. We were talking about, can we take the concepts that Lisa is working on in the data curation network and scale those? And we very quickly had comments coming in. Well, different domains, different countries, different communities will appreciate tuning those primers to how their researchers think. So it goes towards Ixchel's comment on, how does making sure that we're speaking the same language, or bringing this to the language that the researchers are currently using. And my notes need to be cleaned up, so I'm kind of cleaning them up in my head as I'm going here. And then trying to figure out how we can, I'm gonna jump to our idea of number 5 here, where can we pitch a vision that's really huge and start to encourage those that have influence, and our influence comes from our own institutions, our own funders, our own societies, the entities where we all come together in some way to talk about how important data is, and then start to explain to our researchers what that means. And we went right to, well, we can at least get the README file, concept going. Can we at least have a README file? Can we at least have column headers? And those low-hanging fruit and what the basic concepts are, and start the walk down the path. And then there was I forget who said it exactly, but we could even look at it as a hierarchy of needs. First, let's make sure everybody understands these basic concepts. Then let's help them understand these more complex concepts. Then let's walk them here. But that means that we've built that big vision network. And, to some extent that's happening, but we're not necessarily coordinated. Not that we have to be, but we don't have enough players. There's not enough people talking about this yet. So Ixchel, do you want to do maybe 1 or 2 more from your group?
Sure. I've had the anonymous Buffalo has been cleaning up my notes. So thank you very much, because now it's crystal clear as to what's going on. So one of the other ones that folks talked about is, even where a repository can offer full curation services, managing risk, right? So ensuring data are in compliance with the repository, terms of use, no sensitive data, no copyrighted data. So that was one thing. So thinking about those kinds of things. Another was just this idea, which we hear, I think, a lot in different venues, is, you know, starting earlier in the research process, right? It's kind of bridging this huge gap that exists between the data management plan and deposit, right? It's like you start at the beginning and then they call you back in at the end, and there's this big space in between where they're doing all these things and you're not involved. And
well, and can
talk about relationship building around that.
Can I highlight something right there? There's another series of conversations happening with some of the same people in this group, but in a different context. We didn't really highlight the institutional repositories at the NIH conference as much as we wanted to. And I think what you just said about getting earlier in the process, if we can somehow empower that community to be able to, I don't know how to do it. Like, I'm not saying I can figure this out. Like, it's certainly not me, right? But if there's a way, if you can get to the research offices and say, listen, you know, so many minutes into this grant, remember, you, the institution, have liability on this funding. You need to make sure that your researchers have this is an active data management plan, and you have talked to the right people, whoever those are, right, about what you're gonna, I feel like that's another element here. Like, we're not using institutional repositories as much as we should, and they are positioned. Like, they are positioned for this. They're in the gap. They should be in the gap.
Yeah, positioned as well for one thing we were talking about with outreach to students and training and resources that for like early career researchers that they can use throughout the process, not just at the end when they're going to deposit data.
Yes.
Let me just for a second interrupt. If you were not talking about institutional repositories, what kind of repositories were we talking about? I had no idea you were talking about private, you know, repositories, things I put under my bed. What are you talking about? I'm so sorry.
So the way we've been looking at it, generalist repositories are both institutional and what do you call the rest of them? What do you call Dryad?
Oh, okay. Okay. Now I understand. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm sorry.
No, Claudia, it's fine. And I don't know how those words translate outside the United States. Like, I know Zenodo is worldwide, Dryad is worldwide, Figshare is worldwide, database is worldwide, right? But the institutional repository, though they have similar services, serve the folks at their institution. So they have a
scope.
Good, thanks. Good word. They have a scope.
Yeah.
This is Ixchel here. I don't remember in what context, but I had kind of, I think, thrown out this broad thought of institutional repositories working to make their data more discoverable. I'm not saying they're not, but maybe just, you know, concerted efforts of making them even more discoverable, like the generalist repositories, so they come into the play, so that if you actually go and do a search, that things from institutional repositories do pop up more often, or as often as they would from generalist repositories, to get them out to the front and encourage people, hey, this is a place I can actually deposit data. So it could be a way to kind of direct people to that institutional repositories to help make it, if we can make it more data in them more discoverable. Maybe it's done, but I'm just kind of looking at it very naively. If we go and look for certain things, maybe Dryad, Figshare, and Mendeley may pop up, but do the institution repository data and the institution repositories pop up as frequently? Have anybody looked into the metrics associated with that? And that may be something to kind of push for based on the numbers over there, if it's not where we want it to be.
That's really good point. So it's the the perception of value because of where you're showing up within the search criteria or other ways of looking. Yeah, so if you look on AGU's, let's see, actually it's not there yet. There's a new page that AGU is about to put up where I reworked how we talk about repositories, and I've got we point to the PDF that we talked about at the top of our time, built from the NIH collaboration. You know, here's general repositories, and I pull out institutional repositories, and I have TBD under institutional repository. Here's how to think about institutional repositories. I don't have anything to point to, and it's a real frustration. And there's some of the folks on this session have been in conversation with me on this in different ways, including Twitter, and there's not an easy way to highlight, because where your author is affiliated. And so, you know, to talk about, say, Deep Blue or Drum or, you know, what are the other institutional repositories highly, you have to remind yourself, oh yeah, that's right. Can't data there. Actually, that might be a mind blow moment. Why not? Why couldn't you? Oh, there's a thing there. Okay, so you IRs, take a look at that and see what you think. That's a little crazy talk, but that might be a way to promote the curation that already exists. Why couldn't I do that?
Maybe one thing is just as the first step, ask the author to speak to their research data management librarian if they have one, and let them sort of help make a recommendation on where the data should go, whether that's into their IR or into one of the disciplinary repositories.
One thing I would add is that, so speaking from both being at University of California and with Dryad, so it doesn't seem at scale that we're really reaching researchers to say, go to the library and they're going to help find the right place. That's just not happening. And so looking from the other side of it on Dryad, we're talking about, well, how could you get the IR stuff to show up in Dryad because we have good SEO with Google? We're actually doing the opposite now, which is that institutions that we're working with at Dryad, we have a public search API now. You can facet by institutions, and we have 4 institutions starting next week that are going to start to mirror anything from Dryad in their IR and academic commons. So it's totally CC0 data and it's there, but it's kind of the opposite approach. If researchers have already adopted these great practices, great, let's connect it back to the institution. So it's a two-way street, not just moving them if they've already adopted something like Dryad or Dataverse as their community.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's value in that. So, and I should highlight the fact that Dryad works really hard to curate an essential set of metadata, which is really valuable compared to some of our other general repositories that may or may not be able to do that at scale. And we really value the fact that Dryad does that, and have partnered with Dryad on a project that we're working on right now because of that. So just sort of being open about that. Okay, we came to our end. If you're not yet signed up for our community, we're not yet a IG or working group, but I believe, where's Marianne? All right, Marianne, I think we're good here to move forward on becoming a working group, don't you think? I think we have enough interest. And maybe reach out to some of the other relevant working groups. If anyone's part of another group that you think is related, and maybe we should working group on a group, can you please put some notes in the document? I'm okay with that concept. That would be perfectly fine. Let's see, what else did we need to do? Likely we'll try to come back at this topic, take your notes, think about it, have conversations with communities about what this means, and keep RDA as a central player in this conversation, and see if we can come up with a solid plan. It's going to take, I think, everyone on this call and everybody we know, every network we have, to make a difference on this subject. There's a lot of players, a lot of domains, a lot of people. And we're really glad that you all were able to come today. So thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Lisa and Ixchel, thanks so
Bye.
much. I really value
Thanks. Bye-bye.
your talks today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. This has
Thanks.
been great. It's always interesting to hear what's going on. Take care.
Bye-bye.